Welcome to a new episode of Mind Your Mind. I am Roxana Parra Sepúlveda, your host, and today I'm very excited because I will be talking with Laura Dixon. She is driven by attempting to organize chaos, creating, reflecting, learning, and sharing space with others in social justice movements to create more equality and safety for all women. I am so in with you, Laura, and I definitely want to give you a massive welcome to today because we will be talking about some very interesting aspects of a project that you have developed, but I won't say anything until we hear from you. And welcome.
Thank you.
It's so good to have you here. The Feminist Project Management is what we want to talk about today. There is a lot to say about it, so I think we better go straight into the core of everything. And please tell us what motivated you to create the Feminist Project Management.
Of course. And yeah, thank you so much for having me today. It's really exciting to get a chance to talk about it, actually. So yeah, my background. So I've worked in the UK violence against women and girls sector for coming up, I think, 15 years. And about 3 years ago, a number of roles that I've done, I've managed projects, whether they were sort of small local projects or more kind of global international projects around FORG or sort of sexual and reproductive health and rights. And I felt quite a lot of frustration around the projects that I was either managing myself or being a part of. I think it was very much born from a sense of within the projects that we're managing, something doesn't feel right. I was reading a lot about feminist leadership at the time and really thinking about how to practice it and thinking much more about through this lens of power and inequalities and thinking about, I suppose, like a more gentle way of being. And I'm definitely someone who is a bit more of an introvert, I'd say, a bit more gentle, perhaps, in my approach. So within the projects that I was managing, I've found quite a lot of challenges, not only around the way to kind of implement some of the tools that traditional project management uses, but also in the way that they were being implemented. So it often feels as a project manager that you are sort of hounding people very much to kind of think about deadlines and get back what you need. And I remember somebody saying to me, you're not like a traditional project manager because why aren't you telling us off? We're very used to being told off by the project manager. And it was quite shocking to me because I was sort of thinking, oh, that's not my way. That's not how I want to be when I manage projects. I want things to feel really collaborative and like we're working together and sharing power. And I think within project management, there's the way that it's very much been set up is this one project manager who kind of very much organizes everybody. And it feels quite top-down leadership, which is not necessarily the way that I would like to manage projects. So
definitely, even in feminist organizations, we can see that pyramidal kind of structures and the top-down kind of passing of information or planning, etc. So I hear what you're saying in that need of a little bit more horizontality and creating collaborative kind of relationships within the teams to actually run the projects, no?
Absolutely. And I think that, yeah, you sort of hit the nail on the head because actually I'll talk about it later, but there's loads of different ways of managing projects that you can do. But I think the way that we've kind of been shoehorned is that we have this one project manager, very top down, and almost a very authoritarian way of managing projects that just didn't feel right to me. So out of that frustration, I kind of thought, I wonder if there's other people that feel the same, that are struggling with these, it makes sense how to manage projects, but are there other people that are wanting a different way of being within this space? So I reached out to an organisation called CoFem, who are incredible. They work internationally with lots of different feminists and bring people together about different issues related to the domestic abuse or violence against women and girls sector. And they put me in touch with the lovely Jana Visa, who turns out had very similar frustrations. So Jana she does a lot of research in the international space, specifically around, again, sexual health and reproductive rights. And she does a lot of sort of stuff around gender in the international space. So it was unbelievable connecting with Jana because she echoed everything that I was saying and just this real kind of desire to be in a different way, but we didn't know, was this also just us? So CoFem helped us bring together a number of women who wanted to do a learning circle. And that was really our first time that we sort of brought some of our frustrations and our ideas into a space full of other women. And connecting with a community around this was just incredible because we found that there were so many people that also felt the same, that had all of these similar struggles around how project management was really fitting in their context. And I think from our communities, they told us about so many of the challenges, and a lot of it was based around these really rigid ways of being within projects, these very set tools that you used, lots of bureaucracy within project management. If you
Yes,
do sort of
yes,
the traditional Prince 2 or PMBOK sort of models, there's a heck of a lot of paperwork to do.
yes.
Often power inequalities within that
Mm,
project management relationship, but also in terms of kind of the partnerships that you have with different people. So
mm,
we were talking especially internationally when you have sort of in-country partners and how that looks, funding that comes to sort of UK based organizations that then distribute that across the world, and how we
mm,
work with our partners in different countries. We talked about communication and how there's lots of issues with that, and sort of power imbalances within communication. One of the huge things that came up was around pace of projects. And
mm.
a lot of people have talked about this idea of like the tyranny of the urgent. So everything within projects is like time frames, focus, it all feels very rushed. Um,
And I wonder if that's also related to the fact that you are working with I mean, if we think about the charity organizations, for example, working with crisis situations, working with people that are survivors of all kind of traumatic experiences, there is in general that sense of urgency. There is a sense of anxiety. Something needs to be done quickly, as soon as possible. And I hear that demand from our clients that come with a need of resolving that resonates as well within the organizations and in the practice that we may go on and produce, no? That is with that sense of urgency. And I think in that as well, it is that a very, very strong element that we have spoke about before in other episodes about the importance of being trauma informed
mhm.
in our practices, no?
Absolutely. We spoke to so many people who were managing projects for international NGOs that were working in war-torn countries, humanitarian crises. My background myself is working with survivors of domestic abuse, so absolutely
Mhm,
understand, that trauma that's happening within projects. And I think the project management is very rigid,
mhm,
and perhaps not very responsive to a
mhm.
context like that. And often,
Yes.
as a project manager, you think, oh, I need to plan all of this stuff at the beginning, and then we move from sort of the planning stage into the implementation phase. But
Mhm,
I think in practice, what it often feels like is that you often have to go back to planning, because you have to be flexible and sort of see what comes up in these situations. It's not
yes.
running a project with domestic abuse survivors is very different to running a project with an IT, for example.
Yes. Yes.
So there's very much a sense of frustration about, well, these tools have been designed for particular contexts, and they perhaps don't fit the NGO
Mhm,
space.
uh-huh,
Um, so yeah, and I think very much linked to that as well, in that sort of trauma-informed approach, a lot of our community talked about a real lack of care within project management. The focus
uh-huh.
again is timeframes and delivery and outcomes and things. And
Yes.
um, often projects are funded for a really short space of time as well. So
Yes.
everything just feels very tense and rushed. And actually, the importance of care within that is so, so crucial, but
Mm.
not included in any of the mainstream project management models that you're able to see and touch and kind of implement in your role. So yeah, it was.
So, who were you thinking of when you were creating then the feminist management approach?
I think very much other people similar to us that were trying to sort of manage projects, and but feeling like it doesn't really fit within their context. So people
Mm,
who are looking for a different way of being, different tools, different ideas that they could use in their context, and people that wanted to sort of try different things out, I guess.
mm. So I hear from what you're saying is that it's not necessary to be a project manager in order to utilize the tools and the things that we will be talking about today, you don't need to be in that level, let's say, in your organization, or in that level of expertise in your career. I hear that it is a little bit more broad than that, right? Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. So where we're at now is that we've done quite a lot of research into the history of project management and just trying
Okay.
to sort of unpick a lot around it and why have we got to where we've got to.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that we found is that actually the way that projects have always been pitched is very much, coming from this kind of global north, sort of very much like 50s America was when modern project management really started with things like the Manhattan Project and the atomic bomb.
Uh-huh.
Um, and they projects have been framed in a very particular way. So they're led by one individual. Often, they often have high budgets, and that individual has responsibility kind of end to end. And what we've realized since we've been researching is that actually there's so many women and people of color who manage projects throughout history that are not spoken about. They're not sort of viewed as managing projects because they haven't fit this particular model. So
Uh-huh.
some of the examples that we were looking at is things in the UK like Emmeline Pankhurst and the campaign around suffrage in the UK, the Madres of the Plaza de Mayo in Argentina, who very much led that campaign about their disappeared children. We've found loads of examples like Amy Jacques Garvey in Jamaica, who did lots around kind of the civil rights movement, the Black women
Uh-huh.
mathematicians in Hidden Figures. There's all
Mm-hmm.
of these women and people of colour that have run projects, but they've been really left out of the history of project management, perhaps
Uh-huh.
because those projects were potentially run as collectives, or they
I
didn't have a
see.
high budget, or women were only saw sort of one little part of the project.
I see. Mm-hmm.
And we also thought very much that a lot of what our community was saying to us was, I manage projects in my role, but I'm not a project manager. And that
Ah, uh-huh.
really resonated with Yana and I, because we also don't necessarily see ourselves as project managers because we don't necessarily align ourselves with that thinking, but we do manage projects. And we really wanted to expand the idea of what project management is, because so many women manage projects in their home life as well.
As
Things
well,
like moving
yes.
house, getting married, planning the childcare. They can be quite small, like personal projects that we really wanted to shine a focus on, that actually people are doing this all day, every day. And it doesn't have to be this huge, $1 million construction budget. Actually, we need to shine a light on these smaller projects and look at the different practices. And we're specifically interested in projects that run as a collective. So,
Uh-huh.
for example, I'm a trustee of a charity, and that feels very much like a collective when we run particular projects, and people will take different pieces of responsibility, and it's not necessarily one person that sees the entire project from end to end, but that's just as deserving of thinking about what does project management look like within that context as well.
Mm,
So,
mm,
yeah, so we're just really interested. I mean, we do run training about it, and a lot of the people that we that attend our training that it speaks to are people who sort of say, well, I am a project manager as part of my role, but a lot of people have never had formal training. They've just picked it up and found, maybe done a 1 day training course or found
mm-hmm.
tools online that sort of feel that they fit to their context. So we just want to challenge that idea, I guess, and really blow open, how do we define a project firstly, and who is a project manager? And one of our principles that we look at is project leadership can be really diverse, and projects can be really diverse. So there isn't necessarily, or there shouldn't be, a one size fits all model, because
Yes.
your
Uh-huh.
contexts are different, the way that you work is different, so it should be able to flex and fit to that.
And are there specific areas that you pay attention to in the trainings that you are running as well?
Yeah, so the training, we actually begin with a bit of the history of project management, because we
Mm-hmm.
really want people to understand, why are we where we are? And project management itself is, like I said, something that was, as very modern project management has come from the 1950s, from the US. It has come from things like the race for space, construction, very much more recent things like, let's think, like the Kanban approach. That comes from the sort of Silicon Valley and tech
Mm-hmm.
companies from like the 2010s onwards. Um, and we really wanted to sort of show people that actually some of this history is really problematic. And when you dig deeper into it, you find links within project management to things like slavery. So
Mm-hmm.
the Gantt chart, which is a big one that people use. Actually, Henry Gantt came from a slaveholding family in Maryland in the
Mm.
USA. All of project management and a lot of modern management practices as well come from this kind of plantation economy where we were looking and tracking people's productivity essentially.
Uh-huh.
And once you start to see the thread of how productivity is linked to project management, you can start to see it everywhere. So we really start with this kind of critical awareness, I guess, about what projects are. And we it's not for us to say to throw out all of the tools of project management at the moment, but what we say is let's really critically think about some of the current tools exist. So thinking about the history of the Gantt chart, but also a common one that people use is the RACI matrix, which is when you're looking at who's a task that you've got on a project, you're thinking who's responsible, who's accountable, who's been consulted, who's been
Mm-hmm.
informed. And it's just one that we use. It's just a kind of a tool that we think is very neutral. But actually, when you start to unpick the RACI matrix, you start to think about how power exists within
Mm-hmm.
responsibility
Mm-hmm.
and actually whose roles are being invisibilized, if that's a word,
Uh-huh.
through through who's responsible for different things and how does intersectionality play around with this, whose roles are kind of seen as the more promotable sort of visible tasks and who's doing things like the admin or
Mm.
who's writing notes for minutes and things. And you often find that it's women or women of color that are doing these things that aren't recognized. So we're just really trying to dive, I guess, deeper into project management and get people just really critically thinking about some of these tools and whether how do they how can they help us, but also how do they limit us at the same
Yes.
time? And is
Yes.
there a different way of doing things that fits within your context?
Yes. So it makes sense because also what I'm thinking of is this challenge or this almost contradiction between productivity and well-being.
Mhm.
When the focus is on productivity, then what happens with the well-being of our workers?
Mhm.
And part of my experience as well, and what motivated me in doing this podcast is how I have experienced myself and seen in so many teams, in so many areas that I have worked, how people do get burnout. People do have, you're working in feminist organizations or other organizations that are you with have a great intention and have providing great services. But what's going on with their workers? What's going on with their staff? What's going on with the health and the well-being, the awareness of the need of self-care as well within those teams? And I wonder that we can coincide, and I think we can coincide in that no idea that really the way that projects and the management of projects is sort of understood at the moment is really not giving much space to that notion of self-care, well-being, and caring for each other in a way. How do you see that from the approach that you have created?
Yeah, that completely resonates with myself and Yana as well. And a lot of our experience was despite our best efforts, we were all very focused on the outcomes of projects. And, you feel often the work feels really meaningful as well that you're trying to do.
Yes.
But you'd get to the end of a project and you could say, oh, okay, well, we've met all of the outcomes that we set and we've been
Mm-hmm.
funded to deliver. But actually, what we've found is that our staff are completely burnt out and they're frazzled, and we've had X number of staff changeovers or
Mm-hmm.
people have
Mm-hmm.
left before the project has finished. And actually,
Yeah, rotation is such a big thing, right?
yes,
Mm.
absolutely. And it is a real struggle, and that's something time and time again when we run quite a few free webinars and we find people's challenges, and it's something that people keep coming back to, that pace and productivity, specifically within the project management field, and almost even more specifically within the kind of NGO project management field,
Mm.
that burnout is such a big issue. And I think specifically when you're working alongside people with trauma, you need time to reflect and
Yes.
unpack and think about how, you're caring for yourself and each other within that space. And often it feels like that's not thought about, that's not incorporated within to anything about the project. So I think it's really challenging. And we've started to think on a bit of a wider level as well about how
Mm-hmm.
talking in a specifically UK context, but I do believe that this is quite relevant internationally as well, that specifically within the Vogue sector, you often have really short-term projects. So you're funded for a year or so to
Yes.
do
Uh-huh.
something. It's often women working on these projects. And so actually you're doing a heck of a lot in a short space of time, perhaps doing some kind of project that involves co-creation with survivors. You need time for all of that,
Mm,
to build relationships and trust and set up structures for the projects to work in a way that feels more kind and caring for everybody. And I think the way that we view projects is actually, it's almost creating and causing a sense of gender inequality, because people are on these, not only within the project context it's difficult, but they're also conscious, well, I've only got this role for a year, what am I going to do at the end of this project? I've got a mortgage, I've
mm,
got children to
mm,
feed and
mm.
clothe. So it's, I think project, the more that you start to think about and immerse yourself into this world, the more problematic it becomes actually about the way that we are looking at this and the way that we're practicing projects.
Indeed, definitely. And how do you see the element of care and well-being within the feminist project management in a little bit more in the day to day? Because you're saying, I hear what you're saying in terms of the need of time. How do we fit this in a context in a society that actually is all about productivity, sometimes, even false positivity and the fixation with resilience, where there is no really space for working, witnessing the suffering of others every day, and not having any spaces really to say, hey, this case, that story I heard today is particularly resonated with me, or has been particularly painful to hear, and so on. So that time not only goes for, as you're saying, for our clients, but also it needs for our staff. How can you work with that?
I think it's a really good question, and it's definitely a challenge that comes up. So we run training courses for individuals to come on to really have a think about this, because
Uh-huh.
there isn't necessarily an easy answer for that. I can tell
No,
you at the
I
sort of
know.
two levels.
I know.
Yeah, I can tell you at
But
the
we
two
can
levels.
unpack it together.
Yeah, and we've I guess we're working at two different levels to try and
Uh-huh.
talk about that. So um I've got some really practical tips and things for you later, but I can it, on a more general level, as an individual or someone who is writing the sort of outline of a project, we really encourage people to question what success is in your projects.
Uh-huh.
So if you've reached the end of your project and you've ticked off all of your outcomes, but actually, when you think about it, you haven't really built your project around the most marginalized people. It's not as accessible as it could be. And perhaps you have had lots of staff leave, or everybody's really burnt out on the end of the project. Is that success? And
Mm-hmm.
we want to get people thinking that actually success should look not only at progress, but process. So really unpicking, how it's not about the end goal, but how do you
Uh-huh.
want to get to where you're going? What values, what behaviors do you want to uphold throughout that process?
Uh-huh.
And actually, we encourage the people that come on our training course to really think about process as an outcome in itself. So
I
that when you
see.
get to the end, you sort of think, yep, we've met this, and this outcome. But in terms of our process, how was that? And actually, what can we learn about the way that we've worked together, the way that we've worked with our partners, with our beneficiaries, with our funders, and really reflect on that and reflection is one of our really core practices. And
Okay.
we really get people to reflect on, how have you cared for each other in this project, and
Uh-huh.
was that successful as well as, you've met this KPI or that outcome.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So reflection. I mean, that is something that I am so fan of. Understanding that the need of reflective spaces is so essential. And what I hear from what you're saying as well is that focus on the how more than in the what
Hmm.
specifically. That's obviously part of a project, but should not be the only thing.
Hmm.
And the how, and that gives so much importance as well to the process, and that also includes relationships. the relationship with the management, the relationship between organizations within the teams, and how those relationships as well can be force of energy, or a force of motivation to caring for each other. Is that right?
Yeah, completely, completely. I think reflection is just so key to our model because, operationalizing feminist practice is tricky.
Super difficult. Yes.
Yeah, and
Yes, and that's
we,
what we are talking about here as well, about feminism applied to
yes,
in practice. And that's, yeah, it is tricky, definitely.
absolutely. And we
Mm,
need room to be able to make mistakes, but have time to look back and say, what did we do? What happened and what can we do differently? And specifically thinking about power within reflection as well. So what power do you hold if you are the project manager, or what power do we have over this organization that's come in as a partner? So I think reflection is absolutely linked to care, but also with our practices, you find that they all flow through each other, but build on each other as well. So
mm,
the key practices we focus on in our training is sharing power, communication, collaboration, care, and reflection. And they all just, yeah, you can't really have one without the other, because we think about how power flows through reflection, for example, but then also how care is very linked to that, or how communication is also very linked to care and what that means, but also power. Yeah, there's definitely just a huge link between them.
yeah, and that retroalimentación is a word in Spanish that I don't have it in English right now, but it's that influence of each other that you're talking about.
Mm.
And so you mentioned there are two levels. What are those two levels that you were referring to?
Yes, I was going to come back to that. Thank you. So when we're thinking about sort of, how can we get people to think about running projects differently? So we started out trying to work with individuals, and we're still doing that, people who are interested in managing projects differently, and
Mm-hmm.
trying to give them tools and different ideas. And our approach is very values led rather than framework led. So how can I
Uh-huh.
sort of apply this value within my work, and how can I change this? And very much trying to capacity build individuals to create change on their individual projects. But what we realize with anything that you try and do around this is that individuals come up against particular barriers, because there's only so
Yeah,
much agency and power that they have within particular organizations. And even within feminist spaces, we have people, feeling really challenged to put feminist project management into practice.
definitely.
So we've started to think a lot about structural change as well. And we're
Uh-huh.
working with a few different organizations to try and really create change at a much wider level, to think about things like is some organizations call it project sponsorship. So the senior managers who are kind of writing the business ideas for projects and creating for applying for funding, what can they do to really think about setting a project up for success? And even at that stage, thinking about care and reflection, and what will that look like in a project, and how long will that take to do it? And thinking about what practices, policies, etc., they would need to be able to support a feminist project manager within that organization. And it really goes even beyond that, because organizations are telling us, well, we'll try and put all of this stuff in place, but actually the funding models that we have, or the funding that's available, is then a challenge for us. So we've just started thinking about how we work with funders, and
Hmm.
how we can really tackle it at that level to get change, in the way that we think about and manage projects on all of these different levels.
Yeah, because are the funders that will put the conditions, no?
Hmm.
They will set up the conditions for the project to be delivered, and in terms of time and so many other
Hmm.
elements. How do you see their role then being part of obviously changing these structures, but how do you see their role then in this initiative, in integrating a little bit more of that notion of care, of well-being, of understanding, that sort of power, and the integration of collaboration and communication and reflection in the how much value are they really willing to give to all of that? I'm wondering.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I mean, our work with funders is only really just beginnings, but we know a lot of the challenges that we're bringing to them. So we want to try and work with them to find answers. But one of the things that we think, because I think funders have a huge role to play in this, and we want to sort of approach
Uh-huh.
feminist funders as well, who are perhaps warmer to this messaging. But I
Uh-huh.
think that the challenge that we have at the moment is that we see projects as these really standalone endeavors. The project just kind of pops up for a year and then it goes, and we're on to the next thing immediately.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But we've got a blog post on this if people are interested, but we want to look at projects as a bit more from a kind of ecological lens. So instead of being
Uh-huh.
this very linear 7-stage project, almost projects as a bit more of a circular model. So
Okay.
the way that projects should be is not standalone, but very much set within a context of the organization, and they're connected to what came before, but also what will come after. So when you end a project, you really want to think of it as creating a really fertile ground for what comes next, and actually that how
I
we're
see.
pulling through all of that learning and where that we then go. And I think one of the things that's really challenging is that you find that projects are funded and staff are only funded for time on that project, but they exist within a much wider ecosystem of the organization. And project staff need to be able to have time to go to training, to go to like clinical supervision if that's needed, to do, I guess I almost call it like citizenship within the organization and get involved in
Uh-huh.
working groups about anti-racism, for example. And none of
Mm-hmm.
that stuff seemed to be funded by that. So you find,
Mm-hmm.
it's quite restrictive sometimes working within a project. And we really want funders again to think about if you really care about the process, you need time to be able to do this, to set up at the beginning structures around accountability, care, communication, thinking about how you build relationships, especially with marginalized groups who may be mistrusting of the project that you work on, or working with people with disabilities or different needs that may just, again, require that bit more time. So I think it's also thinking about trauma, like we've said, and the role of that within projects. So we really want to sort of raise awareness about this, that
Mm.
it's the less tangible things that are going to make your project more of a success. Trying to put that into the language of funders is something that we're still considering, how we do that.
Yes.
But I think
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
it's all of those intangible things that make people leave the projects or the sector or burn out or feel uncared for. So how can we make projects look different? And again, really challenge funders to think what actually is a project, and what does it mean within its context and for its future and its past, and so hopefully, yeah, we'll make some
Yeah.
headway there. I can keep you updated.
Yes. Yes, please do keep us updated because it's so important. We, I mean, the people that have heard more of one of these podcasts know that I always talk about the fact that self-care and well-being in general is always the responsibility is always put in the individual. But actually, we really need to consider that this is part of a systemic problem. We all have responsibilities. We all have a capacity to, as you were saying, an area where we can do things. And there is so much that we can do at an individual level. But also, there is so much that can be done at a systemic level. And I'm so glad that you are bringing in the funders as well to think about these things, because time is one of the things, I mean, what I hear over and over and over again with everybody that I work, supporting them through well-being sessions or other type of activities, raising awareness about the importance of self-care to care, is time. I don't have time. Everybody, in every single talk, in every single conversation, when we are digging more deep in this, it's like, I don't have time. But how do I do that? How do I do this? There is no time. There is no time to breathe. There is no time in between clients. Is no time to meet. It's not time. There is no time for a reflective practice. There is no, so really that essential sort of element of time to understanding that not only the progression in terms of long term, but also what happens on the day to day and how are we managing that time too, that will allow this space. You talk about self and collective care. How do you see that? Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, that's interesting. And we actually go into that in quite a lot of detail on our training.
Mm-hmm.
And it's funny because in the most recent training course, we were reflecting and saying a lot of people know what self-care is, but knowing sort of how to do it and what it looks like in different contexts is also fascinating. But the link between kind of the self and the collective. So we talk a lot about how, often you have to role model self-care to kind of
Mm-hmm.
then role model a more healthy environment by not staying behind too many hours. So the self and the collective, so your team or your wider organization is so important. Um, and we also talked a lot about how care is so linked to power and intersectionality. So, who has the power to kind of, or the ability or the resources to care? But also, what does care look like on a project? So, we were having
Mm.
really interesting conversations about how care is often set in quite a top-down way. So, organizations will say, okay, well, we've put away X hours and X money for an away day. But quite a lot
Mm.
of people reflecting, that's not really how I care for myself, going out with colleagues. That might be some people's idea of a lovely day out, but for other people, they're like, I don't,
Exactly.
that's really awkward for me or whatever. So,
Yes.
or
That's such a
things,
good example. Yeah, so
yeah,
many times that away day, oh no.
yeah, yeah. Even
That
if
has
it's a
that
fun one,
feeling.
it's
Yeah, yeah,
it's
yeah.
not everyone's idea of care.
No.
And things like I've worked with a few project managers who've said, oh, I do meditation as part of my reflection sessions or check-ins with my team,
Uh-huh.
and having conversations about that and saying, well, not everybody likes meditation, not everyone feels comfortable or safe to be able to
Uh-huh.
practice that. So how does that look, and have you talked to your team about how they like to be cared for? And do you know, I mean, a lot of this feminist practice I think starts with you about knowing how do you like to be cared for by
Careful.
yourself, but the people around you as well.
Mm.
And then being able to communicate that to others and understanding how they like to be cared for and not assuming, because I think that's what a lot of us do. And actually, yeah, care is a language in itself for many people.
Mm. Definitely. And to have those options, no,
Mm,
to alternatives and the possibility to reflect together about it, what's really meaningful.
mm,
Yeah, you make me think about Germán Morales, the episode is coming soon. Um, and he was telling me about the experience of a team that decided that the best way of caring for themselves was to go out on a Saturday every once a month or something like that, no? And then when they actually got to talk about and that reflective spaces were created later and they started to talk about it, they were like, you know what? I don't really want to spend my day off with my colleagues, not for nothing wrong with that, but I really like to be with my family or do my chores at home or be with myself or go and play tennis with a friend or I don't know, to do some activity that is really meaningful for you more than just imposing these sort of fantastic ideas about what well-being look like when actually people are not really into that or is really not what they prefer to do. It's so important to have that element as well, conversation around that too.
I agree. And actually, some of the most beautiful and radical examples that we've heard of people who are already working in quite feminist spaces, and
Uh-huh.
it tends to be more like the international NGOs, that actually they just have a tiny pot of budget and each person gets to choose what they do with that budget for their own care. And
Oh,
people
fantastic.
appreciate that sense of choice and agency around the way that they choose to care for themselves. So I think, yeah, there's a lot to be said for not assuming and, making collaborative decisions around care.
Absolutely. We are reaching that time on the episode in which we are heading to a closure, but always at this stage, I want to go into the practical. You have already given us some ideas, but if you can share a little bit more about probably some practical tips, or what do you think are the very first steps towards that work from a feminist project management approach, and what can be the focus around well-being around that too? No, we are already saying some things and giving some tips, but can you share a few more just to give a closure to today with our classic call to action, ideas for implementing.
Course. So I think very first is kind of a really top line thing. It's thinking about care, not as something that you should do or you have to do or whatever, but it's a direct way of resistance against capitalism, against productivity, against this history that's linked to slavery and productivity and urgency and all of that stuff. So it's really thinking that it is a really radical practice, and you're using that to put a full stop at the end of, one sentence before you begin another sort of thing. And thinking about how you do that in a more tangible way, it's really integrating care into the way that you work. So a couple of tangible ideas. So when you're writing a project time frame, you're looking at things like how much annual leave your staff have got, how many bank holidays, if that's relevant, childcare days that they may have, add in the sick days that they may potentially take, because it creates a buffer in terms of, we're always looking for time, right? And if we
Yes.
don't look at this stuff, it kind of catches up with us, and we have to think about staff needing sick days. It's our right to take them if we don't feel well, if something befalls us on the way of a project. So if you add those in, you're already starting to create this time buffer. And we've already talked about this, but asking the staff how they want to care for themselves and each other. So setting up, this is what we mean about time, in those structures at the beginning around care and what it looks like.
And such a good idea as well, what you just said earlier about creating a little budget so people can use that for their own benefit and their own activities that they choose to do.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you're someone who has the power and you're kind of writing project funding applications and things, that whole phrase, like nothing about us without us, consult people on how much time does it really take to do something, because it's, I think, where we fall down a little bit, especially in the Vogue sector, is estimating project time. And I think that we don't think about stuff like sick days and all of those other things. And when people are being pulled between projects, or, if another funding thing comes in. So, really sitting down and working with people at all levels to really, accurately time things. And one thing that I really feel passionate about, especially because we talked about often projects can be 1 year funded and people feel very precarious towards the end of a project. So thinking about how you close down your project in a way that you're thinking about joy and you're celebrating what's happened, you're sharing success, you share gratitude, but really practical things like sit down and have a session where you update your CVs together and you tell each other, oh, you did great on that. Remember when you tackled that challenge in that part of the project. That will really help you when you go onwards. Potentially thinking about writing testimonials for others. If you're in a management position, for example, that can be really helpful. And thinking about time off for people to be able to think about the next project. So yeah, hopefully that's helpful. There's loads more that we talk about on our training, and we do blog posts and things trying to because I think what people really want is this tangible way of being. And I know often I find a frustration between, feminist leadership and project management feels this ideal, but what are these really practical ways of doing it? So yeah, we're still listening to our communities and trying to shine a light on the best practice, but those are just some that came to me.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And yes, this is evolving. No, we're thinking together about this, and that's also the purpose of this podcast, to continue thinking about this. What are the different angles? Because there are so many, and all depends as well on the context that you are working on, that you are living in, and also is about that notion of project planning being such a task that you will not be able to deliver if you don't have a healthy sort of group of staff, a healthy sort of organization to actually deliver it. So we need each other, no? And sometimes we lose sight of that because, and I think somehow it may be natural as well because we want to resolve social issues, no? We are focused on the need of the people that we want to support, and it's so easy to lose sight of ourselves and what's going on within the organizations sometimes. So I really appreciate your conversation with me today, Laura. Thank you so much for being here today. And yeah, there is a lot of ideas, the self collective care, the trauma-informed practices, the idea of connecting with the communities, running projects not only in an individual way, but as a collective as well.
Mhm.
And this radical practice that is about care. No? And so thank you so much for all and many more of the ideas that you share with us today. I really
Thank you so
appreciate
much for
it.
having me. I've loved talking about it. So thank you.
Thank you. And to say to everybody that is listening to the podcast today, please share it. Help us to help and share this episode if you notice that is really has been valuable for you, maybe for your organization as well, for your managers and so on. Share it widely. But also to say that we will be adding all the links and the information that Laura was talking about today in the description of this episode. And yeah, thank you very much for being there. Let us know how you found this episode and what have you learned about it. We want to hear from you. So thank you everyone for those of you that are listening and for you as well, Laura.